Get out the turkey, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce. Here in the United States, it is November 23rd, 2016, one day before Thanksgiving. Over in the UK, it is not one day before Thanksgiving, but we do have Rob Staten with us again from Sheffield, I believe is the right way to say it, over in the UK. He's our Seahawks draftblog.com guy, here to talk about the draft. Me, the guy who's been talking nonsense for the last 30 seconds. I'm Kenneth Arthur of fieldgoals.com, and this is 3000 NFL Mock Draft. We're talking Seahawks. We're talking Eagles. We're talking rookies. We're talking Jared Goff. We're talking UW. We're talking Waz. We got it all covered today as we head into the long Thanksgiving weekend. You're here listening to us, and you want to get right to it, so let's do it. But let's begin with the experiences of Rob Staten and Kenneth Arthur, who this week, we've been having this college football draft podcast for, going on 2 years, close to. This will be our end of our second season. And it was the first time that we both went and attended college games. Myself going to Colorado to watch Wazoo take on the University of Colorado in a 2 top 25 matchup that Colorado did win that game by 14 points. And Rob going up to Seattle and seeing the Huskies take on Arizona State. The Huskies win, setting up an Apple Cup for the North Division in the Pac-12. Whoever wins the Apple Cup this week will be going to the Pac-12 championship. It's perhaps the most significant for both teams Apple Cup in the history, over 100 years for each team. In that game, perhaps the most significant of all time. And that's something that we sort of each got a preview of on one side this weekend. So let's start with you, Rob. Tell me about your experiences of going to Husky Stadium and seeing the Huskies take on Arizona State. First, as from a fan standpoint, how was it? And second of all, what did you see on the field in person that you liked?
Well, it's very different going there than, that's the first thing I noticed more than anything was it's very different compared to the Seahawks games. There's not the same kind of feeling before the game. It's not quite as, I hope I'm not disrespecting anybody who follows Washington closely here, but it was not quite as loud in the stadium as it is for the Seahawks games. But it's quite a laid back and quite a friendly atmosphere. I thought that the team in general played pretty average and didn't look like the team that we sort of saw in the Stanford game earlier in the season. They didn't look like the kind of team that could, really give a challenge to somebody like Alabama. He is, but especially so in this case. Or even a team like I'd fear for the Huskies playing somebody like Oklahoma at the moment, the way that they were playing, because they were very stout up front, took away the run game of Arizona State. I think the defensive line played very well. They've clearly got some good playmakers at cornerback, and I thought Budda Baker had a really good game. But Jake Browning just doesn't seem to be on it at the moment. And I actually met up with Mike Barr, who does a bit of writing for Field Goals. Kenny, I'm sure you know him quite well. He suggested that maybe Jay Browning was a little bit hurt, that he got hurt in I think it was the USC game or the Utah game he was suggesting. And that was maybe because throwing downfield, there just didn't seem to be that same zip on his downfield throws that we'd seen earlier in the year. And his accuracy for most of the night was pretty off. And I think if the Huskies are really going to not just push Washington State, but win the game, they're going to need Jay Browning to play a little bit better than he did against Arizona State. That said, it was a blowout win for them. A lot of players on the field that night. The sort of the front three of Qualls, of Gaines, and Vita Vea, who I thought was the best of the three, were exceptional. Budda Baker, as I mentioned, just had a fantastic game. And it was great to be able to sort of see him from up high, because often it's very difficult to watch safeties on the draft breakdown tape or on the TV. So it was great to sort of see him and his full range of skills. And the cornerbacks, they didn't really test Sidney Jones. They kind of stayed away from him. But Kevin King had this fantastic one-handed interception and looked really, really good on the day. So lots to like. Really enjoyed the experience. It's a little bit different to the NFL stuff that I've experienced in the past. But I'm certainly looking forward now to seeing what they can do against Washington State. I also saw a bit of that game, Kenny, and
Mhm.
it was a bit of a disappointing day for Washington State. I'm sure you'll tell us about that now.
Yeah, I mean, in that first half, I went to, Denver and then went over to Boulder. And, that first half, and first of all, it was freezing cold, as someone who lives in LA by choice because of, a myriad of reasons. But one of them that I like about it is obviously the fact that I don't have to face that weather like we do in Seattle oftentimes, and definitely in Colorado. But it's freezing cold and sitting there, and the Cougs went up 14-7 at one point, and it started to feel like, yeah, this is a special team that's going to go on the road in the Pac-12 to number 10 Colorado and beat them and show that they are a legitimate team. And I think that they were the better team in the first half. But then slowly but surely it became apparent that the Washington State defense was pretty much just had no answers for Colorado's quarterback and their running a game and even their passing game. And, there was nothing really in the second half. I mean, the way that Wazoo got beat there in the third and fourth quarter, especially the fourth quarter when they needed, basically any stop could have turned it in their favor. And given them a chance to put the offense on the field and score a point that, score a touchdown that would have changed the outcome. But defensively, nothing was there. Colorado is the better team. We got to see that. We got to see them. We got to see Colorado beat, I think, a pretty good Wazoo team to get to where they are and to, prove that their attack is something to be taken seriously. If Colorado does, win the Pac-12 South and then wins the Pac-12 championship, depending on what happens to the teams ahead of them, of course, I think that, there is fair a shot to go to the playoffs as any other team, beside, after Alabama, there's nothing wrong, I think, with putting a Pac-12 champion Colorado in the playoffs there. I do think, of course, like I think about pretty much everyone else, that they'll get destroyed by Alabama. But, I thought that Colorado looked really good, played really well. I thought that Wazoo's defense played pretty poorly and, missed some offensive opportunities. And that's pretty much it. But, the way that they played in the first half and the way that they, had opportunities if they just made a play rather than getting, blown out or looking like, it's not so much they looked crappy, but it was just like they just looked like a team that was facing off against a better team, which is going to happen sometimes. So I'm very hopeful for the future in the fact that, if they can stop losing to FCS teams in week one, that, by next season, the Cougs, if Luke Falk comes back, pretty much they're going to get everyone back except for maybe Gabe Marks. So I think that there's a good shot that Wazoo could be a top 5 team next season. And that's something that I'm looking forward to. But I'm not giving up on this season because if they beat UW in the Apple Cup, they're going to the Pac-12 championship. They could get a rematch against Colorado on a neutral field, do some things differently and maybe get, a Rose Bowl berth. And if not that, a really, really good bowl game, that'll hopefully give them momentum going into next season. But I think the way that their offensive line has played this season has shown, and the way that they've run the ball this season has shown that, Mike Leach is more than just a one-trick pony type of coach. What did you think?
Well, the bits that I saw, I mean, in the start of the game, it looked as if Washington State were going to, I thoroughly expected them to go on and win the game because Colorado were not, they were not threatening. I thought that it was a pretty decent start by Falk and the quarterback, and like the way they were moving the ball. I think Gabe Marks had a drop early on, which was kind of unexpected for him. Falk had put it into an area where there were 2 receivers going for the same ball, if I remember correctly, and it kind of maybe just put Gabe Marks off a little bit, but it kind of went straight through his hands. And you could just see as I stopped watching it, the game was just starting to turn towards Colorado. And then, I didn't see the end of the game, but when I saw the score, when I got to Husky Stadium, I was a little bit surprised at the way it ended. But I just think that playing Colorado in Colorado was perhaps the thing for Washington State. I think if it was and then there's a chance that the scoreline would have been reversed. And the other thing I would say is that I think it might be the best result for Washington State. It might just give them, if they'd have gone to Colorado and won, it would have set this up perfectly for them for this Apple Cup. But at the same time, they've lost. It gives the coach a chance to sort of, offer a reality check to the players. I think Mike Leach has said some home truths this week and was very on it, gave a very honest assessment after the game about the lack of physical nature within his team. So I think that this might just spark them into life a little bit. And I think the fact that it is at Washington State as opposed to a Husky Stadium might just give them the edge in this one as well. It's going to be a fascinating game, though. And because of the losses that Washington have had with they've lost their edge rusher, Mattis, they've lost Tasim Victor, because Jake Browning's not playing as well as he was at the start of the year, it is going to make it a very close game.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much anticipation for the Apple Cup this year. I mean, there's always anticipation locally, but now we're in a situation where if you went to one of these schools, or if you root for the Huskies because you had some sort of connection through Seattle and never actually attended the school, and just go around telling everyone about how they're your Huskies and you never went there. That's not something that Wazoo guys really do. Wazoo, fans are pretty much, they went to that school. I'm not saying anything. I'm not saying that Wazoo is better than UW for that reason. I'm sure a lot of the people listening to this podcast that are Huskies fans went to the school, and to everyone else that's a Huskies fan, to the millions out there, good job. We'll see what happens in the Apple Cup. It's fine that you didn't go there. You did live in Seattle for a year, so no worries there. But can the game actually live up to the hype with the Apple Cup, being what it is? Will it be that game that comes down to the final play? I think that it really could be, and it'll be definitely exciting and gut-wrenching for, everyone involved. And somebody will come away with a win and, hold it against the other team for the rest of their lives. So very excited for that Apple Cup, to be sure. And that Apple Cup is taking place on Friday, November 25th. So that'll be this Friday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Number 5 Washington, number 23 Washington State. I don't know if Apple Cups have ever taken place with two teams in the top 25, maybe once or twice, but never something quite this dynamic, because when we can talk about the Pac-12 implications, but hey, if Washington loses this game, their playoff hopes are dead. If they win this game, he's got a very good shot at playing it for the national championship. So there's a lot on the line for Washington. They have to go to Pullman. They have to play in some pretty harsh conditions. It'll be a really good game. And Luke Falk and Jake Browning, two of the best quarterbacks in the entire nation. It'll be interesting to see. What do you, if you got a little bit of a chance to watch Luke Falk this week, and some of the stuff that let's just assume that he comes back next year, because I'm sure that right now it would be hard to see him. Maybe he would get something like a 3rd or 4th round type grade. But do you have any other additional thoughts on Luke Falk's pro hopes?
Yeah, I do. I did watch him. What I was watching, I kind of focused on him, and I actually met up with one of the regulars on Seahawks Draft Blog, and we spent a little bit of time talking about Luke. And one of the issues with him is that he is quite accurate, and he does a lot of things well. But physically, he's not great, and this is going to be the issue for Jay Browning as well, funnily enough. But there was one route where the receiver's kind of running up, and then he's gone out to the sideline, and Folks timed it very well. He's thrown it back shoulder. The receiver turns around. The ball's left Folk's hand before the receiver's even turned around. It's there on a play for him. But the lack of zip on this pass, and I just couldn't help but think, in an NFL game, that's the kind of pass that gets picked off and returned for a touchdown. And it's that's the issue really when you watch a lot of these quarterbacks who are not physically great, is are they going to be able to drive the ball into sort of those particular kind of throws? Are they going to be able to do the same into a tight window? There was one throw that Russell Wilson tried to make at the weekend, which was, it's pretty incredible that because he is quite a conservative quarterback on dangerous throws, but he threw it into the tiniest window and almost threw it too hard in the end, and it went sort of straight through. I think he was trying to target Doug Baldwin, who had about 3 guys on him. It was the tiniest window he was trying to fit this pass into. Couldn't make it work. I couldn't help but think, watching Browning and Falk at the weekend, that they'd have no chance of throwing into a tight window like that. If they both return, and I hope they do, next year, then I think the one thing that they really have to work on is just strength, just arm strength, because they are accurate. I like the way they handle themselves. In terms of character, you can imagine them leading a team, but they're not even at Matt Ryan level physicality. And you sort of really need that as a basic if you're going to make it in the league. There's very few quarterbacks who make it with that level of physicality. I think Kirk Cousins is probably one of the few exceptions. And it took him, and he basically had sort of 3 years sitting and watching and waiting and training within an NFL system. So I suspect that he's probably improved his strength in that time. Because he's 5 years into his career now, so he's had that time to do that. If either of these two come into the league and declare early, so in Browning it would be to declare in a year, for Folk it would be to declare now, then I'm suspecting they would do that on the premise that they would go relatively early and then may not get the time that Cousins has had. So that's certainly something that I would consider if I was those two.
Just looking around the nation real quick from this last weekend, we talked about Donta Foreman. We've talked about him a lot. He had another 250-yard game. That's 3 250-plus yard games in the last 4 weeks, though. It came on 51 carries in an overtime loss to Kansas. 4.9 yards per carry. Not that spectacular at the college level. You get 51 carries, but it is sort of just interesting that, and here's a guy that is 137 yards shy of a 2,000-yard season, and nobody's talking about him. Some people, obviously, but it's just sort of, we've talked about him a lot on the podcast, but he's just, it's just interesting how much production he'll have for a guy that maybe isn't that exciting, and he'll probably end up with more rushing yards at Texas than some of the greats that have played there and as well as that area. Another guy that had a lot of yards this weekend was Christian McCaffrey, 31 carries for 284 yards in a win over California, 9.2 yards per carry. McCaffrey going into the season as a Heisman favorite, in the middle of the year, very unproductive, 49 yards against Washington, 35 yards against Washington State, didn't play against Notre Dame, 92 yards against Colorado, but over the last 4 weeks has been on fire with 169 yards, 199 yards, 135 yards, and then, like I said, 284 yards this week. He's still productive somewhat in the passing game, catching, about 74 yards over the last 2 weeks in the receiving game. So an all-around special talent. But one that we haven't been talking about as much this year because of the lull in the middle of the season and the fact that he wasn't putting up these phenomenal, fantastic numbers that he did as a sophomore last season with Stanford when he almost won the Heisman Trophy. Rob, what are your thoughts now on Christian McCaffrey? Do you think that this recent surge in production will help his draft stock in April? And where do you think that he ultimately lands?
Yeah, it should help him a little bit, just because you don't want to go into the draft on a lull. So you don't want to go into it sort of at the worst point in your college career, and that was kind of happening for McCaffrey. So the fact that he's kind of dragging that team back into relevance after a couple of blowout defeats, the fact that he is putting up the big numbers again is good for him. I think that he's a really good prospect. I think that he's becoming a little bit underrated because, as you mentioned, there's people like Donta Foreman, and with the greatest respect to him, he's doing what he's doing against Big 12 defenses. And I'd fancy me and you, Kenny, to go out there and get a crafty 50 yards against the Big 12 defense. It's that bad. So, I take his production is great. And when people say the same for people like Joe Mixon as well, I was kind of think, yeah, but let's see him do it against a really good opponent. Let's not just see him do it against Kansas or, some other horrible defense like Texas Tech, for example. And McCaffrey's, I think he's facing better opponents. I think that we've seen him have, incredible games in many different facets, as a receiver out the backfield, as a running back, as a return guy as well. You can use him in many different ways. He's extremely tough. If you sort of see him with his shirt off, he's in incredible shape, incredibly muscular. That might hurt him a little bit because, guys that are that tightly wound do tend to have more muscle injuries. But he's incredibly tough. He's a bit more sudden than I think people realize. He will get to the line and he's got a burst to him, which is really good. He makes people miss in the second level a lot more than people realize as well. He is quite tricky to bring down. And I think there are teams out there that really love this type of back, the ones that they can use in many different ways. Detroit is an offense that has been quite creative with that. They gave Reggie Bush an opportunity to sort of rekindle his career a few years ago, and I could see them using him in a similar way. There are one or two other teams as well. I mean, you could see someone like Denver and Gary Kubiak using a guy like this, and I think there is a bit of Arian Foster to McCaffrey's game as well. He's not the biggest guy in terms of like whether or not he'd be a potential Seahawk. He doesn't fit the average sort of size that they've gone for. You know, the running backs that they've taken, we mentioned this before, whether it's Spencer Ware or Alex Collins or Robert Turbin, Kristen Michael, CJ Prosise, they are almost exclusively 5'10", 5'11", 6 foot, in that kind of ballpark. And they average out at 220 pounds. I think it's 221 pounds, the average of all of the running backs they've taken. So that's the kind of body type you're looking for. I think McCaffrey's about 5'10", and about 200 pounds exactly. So we'll see what he is at the combine, but that is considerably smaller than the Seahawks have gone for. And with them being more of a physical, run it up the middle type of team, I'm not sure that he's someone the Seahawks would consider, but I think he is going to go in sort of the 20s. I think he'd be a really good pick actually for someone like Washington, because he's mentally tough, really, all in, committed, a football guy. And that's the type of player that Scott McCloughan's been drafting, and they could do with a running back. So I could see Washington potentially being a destination for him.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think we'd all like to see it, wherever he winds up. Speaking of the Big 12 defenses, this is interesting. The league's or the nation's leading rusher this week was West Virginia's Justin Crawford, who rushed for 331 yards against Oklahoma. West Virginia lost 56-28. So in a game in which a player rushed for 331 yards, he lost by 28 points, to Oklahoma. So not much going on there defensively, but I do want to bring up another player in that game, Dede Westbrook. Some incredible catches we've seen from Westbrook recently. He's had over 100 yards in 7 of his last 8 games. He had 2 catches for 100 yards this week, including that 75-yarder. And it feels like more and more each week the senior Dede Westbrook gets talked about on a level that makes it seem like maybe in the draft next year he could be considered a really, really special player. And I'm thinking, is this a guy that will be, an Odell Beckham at the next level, or, maybe not someone like that, but someone who is going to be very productive? What are your thoughts on Dede Westbrook right now?
The size worries me a little bit. I mean, it's kind of the same situation with Paul Richardson. When Paul Richardson was at Colorado, he was probably like about 170 pounds. And you kind of look at Dede Westbrook and you think, yeah, that could be the same for him. He's really sort of had 1 year of production, and that's this year. And I'm kind of torn a little bit on him, because you sort of see these games where he looks really explosive and sharp, and you think, yeah, there's something to work with there. There have been other games as well where he's not really had an impact. I remember the Ohio State game was a good example of this, where just didn't really trouble the Buckeyes at all in a game that Oklahoma lost. He's put up big numbers. I remember he had the huge game against Texas, for example. He had a big game against Texas Tech. But again, we're talking about the Big 12 here. And the Big 12 is just an absolute shambles. It's a joke of a conference. I mean, it's just horrible to watch, because the defenses have just become so bad that there's just no balance to it. It's like nearly every team in the conference is just this explosive spread offense, and they can't do anything on defense. And it does make it like, I think the comment from one of the Washington coaches about Washington State's style of play is that it's just basketball on grass. Well, that's probably an over-exaggeration for Washington State, but that's certainly the case in the Big 12. So when you see someone like Dede Westbrook, you are kind of torn as to, what exactly, how good is he? Let's see him do it against the big opponent, and he didn't do it against Ohio State as a receiver. So, and they've got 3 of the best defensive backs in the country, all going to be potentially first-round picks. So he didn't do it against them. He did do it against the Big 12 defenses. I want to see him do it. If Oklahoma, and they've got a chance of getting into the playoffs because of this bizarre situation involving Penn State potentially getting to the Big 10 championship at the expense of Michigan and Ohio State. If that happens, and let's say Washington State wins the Apple Cup, then there's a very realistic chance that Oklahoma, as the Big 12 champions elect, could get into the top four. So if that happens, let's see Dede Westbrook have a big game in the playoffs. But I think at the moment, if I was to sort of pick one player that I prefer who is maybe similar, it's probably Curtis Samuel at Ohio State, who's running back as well as receiver. You know, they use him in a lot of different ways. But for me, Curtis Samuel is that sort of multifaceted, you know, Percy Harvin style athlete and, you know, trick play guy and can do a lot of different things. Whereas Dede Westbrook is maybe more one-dimensional receiver, does what he does well, has some explosive plays, but, you know, has he got the ability to have a major impact to the next level? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not totally convinced at this stage.
All right, we'll get back to college football and some of the other prospects in the draft here later in the show. I want to talk about the Seahawks right now and their win over the Philadelphia Eagles, another game that you attended, Rob. You're, one game a year, and I believe a situation that you had never seen a Seahawks win before in live in person. And so they came in with the number one DVOA team, the Philadelphia Eagles, supposed to provide a elite matchup of maybe the two best teams in the league, according to Football Outsiders, at least in the way that they've played this season efficiently against their opponents. But the Seahawks didn't really have any issues dismantling them and winning 26-15. Could have been worse. Could have been a much bigger win, giving up some points there at the end, and putting up a season high 439 yards of total offense, while the defense was able to, and again, they gave up some points at the end. They were already without Earl Thomas and Deshaun Shedd at that point. Some injuries there. If you look at the Seahawks, the last 7 games, they have turned the ball over one time. One turnover in the last 7 games. They are number one in the NFL in giveaways, and Russell Wilson has thrown, I believe, just 3 interceptions in his last 500 and some attempts I saw on Twitter today. So the Seahawks had no problem with the Philadelphia Eagles, though it will be interesting to see how they perform with shorthanded next week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and we'll talk about that. But Rob, you got to see a win in person. Tell me what that was like, and what it was like to see Russell Wilson perform live this season as he's, starting to really fire up again.
Well, it was great to go and see the game, Kenny. It was really good. I mean, first of all, I should say, for anybody who's listening to this, and Mike as well, I met up at the Huskies game. Kenny, who I met up with at the hotel and was very generous to bring us a gift, and a guy calls himself Seahawkrates on the like Socrates on the blog, and he was very kind and left a gift at the hotel for us. Really appreciate you guys being interested in chatting to a British guy who has got an interest in American football, and just thanks a lot, especially for the gifts. At the Seahawks game, it was everything that I could have wanted. From having travelled 4,800 miles to watch the Seahawks play, I just wanted a comfortable win. I wanted to see Russell Wilson make some big plays, which he did. There's loads of explosive plays. The running game got going as well. We saw big explosive. We saw the longest run there's ever been at CenturyLink, 72 yards from CJ Prosise. So great to be there for that. We saw Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor have interceptions. We saw the trick play with Russell catching the pass as well, and that was right at the end zone we were sat. So from all of that, everything we could have hoped for. I did not want to watch a good game. I wanted to watch a Seahawks win. And if it was the easiest win of the year, which it probably was apart from the Niners game, then that was just fine with me. In terms of the matchup itself, I was a little bit surprised, as I think most people will have been, at the relative ease of the contest, because the Eagles are the number one, or they were the number one DVOA team. I fully expected their defense to cause the Seahawks problems, and it didn't. That if the Seahawks offensive line had a terrific day, not just the fact that they constantly created creases for the running game, and the running game had its best game of the season, but also Russell Wilson, I think he had 1 sack, and that's when he scrambled up the middle, and it was like half an inch away from being just a no gain or 1 yard gain or something. So really, they didn't give up a sack in that game. And all we heard going into it was Connor Barwin's going to be a problem, and Fletcher Cox is going to be an issue, and Brandon Graham's having an amazing year. And I only really noticed that Fletcher Cox and Connor Barwin were on the field when they both went off injured in the second half, and they announced on the PA that they were the guys that were going off, and the Seahawks fans politely applauded them off the field because there was no real threat in that. That's the kind of day it was. There was no animosity to the Eagles at all. It was all very friendly. I thought that in general it was just a really solid performance. But I also feel like, I don't know, I don't quite feel like the Seahawks are at their best yet. I still think there's more to come from them. I think especially on defense, and while they are having more sacks than anybody else this year, I don't feel like the pressure is quite as consistently good as it has been in the past. And Michael Bennett coming back in the next couple of weeks will certainly improve that. But a good win. It was a reminder, Kenny, of how loud that stadium is. And I know that people have suggested that since the first Super Bowl win, the atmosphere has not been quite as intense in that stadium since then. But that was as good as the first time I went to CenturyLink 10 years ago, almost to the day. It was so loud, so atmospheric, so intimidating for the opponent. And I wonder if that played a little bit of part in it. But I thought the Seahawks were overwhelmingly better than Philadelphia, and hopefully they're going to keep this going now. And I think this is a nice test coming up next against Tampa Bay, because they're an opponent that has found a little bit of form themselves. It's a road game. It's a long trip, albeit not a 10 o'clock start. It's going to be a 1 o'clock start. It's the later game in Florida. So this is going to be a really interesting one. If the Seahawks can go to Tampa Bay and win, having seen off the Patriots and the Eagles, then I think we can feel very optimistic about the way that this team is going.
Definitely. I mean, it's somewhat surprising at this point, the Seahawks are 7-2-1. And if you had said before the season, look, after 10 games, Thomas Rawls is not going to have any touchdowns. Tyler Lockett's not going to have any touchdowns. Jermaine Kearse isn't going to have any touchdowns. Paul Richardson's not going to have any touchdowns. Luke Wilson's not going to have any touchdowns. If you had said all that and said, this team's not going to have any scoring production from any of those guys, and for the most part, because of injuries, really not that much production at all, that they're going to be 7-2-1. It's pretty surprising, and yet here we are. The Seahawks offense is doing quite well recently. They've scored 26 points in the last 3 games, plus 26 plus in the last 3 games. They've managed to turn around some of those offensive problems that they had in Week 7 against the Arizona Cardinals when they tied 6-6 after 5 quarters. And they're still managing to get through. And not only that, you would have to say that George Fant would be the starting left tackle, that Reese Adiyambo would have to have come in and played some left tackle, that they've sort of had to rebuild a lot of their team as they do almost every year, and as they did last year when we saw the offensive line start to become, more cohesive and gel, and really start to look better at the end of the year. But then, even as that happened, having to replace those guys, with the Russell Okung and the J.R. Sweezy, and moving Justin Britt and plugging in Mark Lewinsky, and, at that point thinking, well, at least there's still Gary Gilliam, and Gary Gilliam sort of falling apart, losing that left tackle job, maybe being the weak link on the offensive line right now. And you look ahead to next season, though, and you start to realize, George Fant is obviously signed for a while, and Mark Lewinsky is signed for a while, and Justin Britt is signed through next season, though you can't extend him, and Jermaine Afidi is signed for a while, and Reese Adiyambo is signed for a while, and it's like, is the future of the position, as the future of the entire offensive line here right now? Are they all, under 26 years old? Are they all pretty much going to be on their rookie contracts at least through next season, and in the case of everyone but Justin Britt, for a couple more years after that? And a lot of them are rookies and, in that stage of their career where they could only just be getting better and gelling together. Rob, what are your thoughts on the offensive line? What were your thoughts on George Fant these last couple of weeks, and of Reese Adiyambo in his NFL debut on Sunday?
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought they played so well the other day because, as I mentioned, the Eagles really didn't, at no real point did you feel, and there's been these games in the past, even this year, when you just sort of feel a defensive line smothering the Seahawks. It was that way in Arizona in the Tide game, and that never really felt the case here. It also helps that Russell is more mobile. That certainly helps. He was taking some deeper drops on play action. I mean, if you notice, and people can look for this, if you notice, Carson Wentz was doing this as well. So on play action, he was dropping really, really deep, and it does just give you that extra bit of time to have a look. And you have to throw it further, of course, because you've taken a deeper drop, but it does just give you that extra bit of time, and you can also see what's in front of you. So if you have to extend the play, then it's easier to do. And I think Wilson hasn't been doing that because it's harder for him to sort of drop back, plant, and throw. He's pretty much having been able to get the ball and get it out very quickly because of his injuries. So I think him doing that was a major benefit. I think some of the throws that he made at the weekend, just some of the angles he managed to throw the ball at, were just phenomenal. I came away from the game, Kenny, and the offensive line were really good, but my sort of lasting impression from the game was Wilson's playing like the best quarterback in the NFL again, which is exactly what he was doing a year ago. I don't think I would not take any quarterback over Russell Wilson with the way that he is playing. It's just everything that he does. It's the way that, you've got the improvisation, you've got that ability to extend a play miraculously, and then turn. I mean, that throw to Jimmy Graham, which led to the first passing touchdown, the second touchdown of the day. That's a 3rd and 11, and it's going absolutely nowhere. And probably about 29 of the starting quarterbacks in the league just throw that into the stand and they kick a field goal. And Wilson is practically not just at the line, because if it had gone an extra yard or two further forward, he would not have been able to throw that. It would have been a penalty, it would have been an illegal throw. But he's also contorted his body to stay in bounds and thrown it almost across his body to get it to Jimmy Graham, who makes the brilliant catch and then a run for a touchdown. But just to be able to turn that situation into a touchdown is miraculous. But then he's also doing the basic things, like he's making right decisions. He's throwing accurately from the pocket. He's throwing deep downfield with accuracy. He's basically got everything that you would ever want from a quarterback. And I think that, the talk of him being league MVP, I think he's legit. I think that you can't always just look at the numbers and say, oh, well, Matt Ryan should get it then because he's going to throw for 5,000 passing yards. That means that's nonsense. It can't be judged on that. The fact is that Wilson, at a time when this team couldn't run for a dime, had injuries galore, including to the quarterback, he kept them ticking over. They've gone from a situation where we were on this podcast, and I've written about this as well, Kenny, a few weeks ago, where the target for the Seahawks, because they were so injured, was just try and win the NFC West. That's the situation now. They'd lost a couple of games, just win the NFC West and get to the playoffs. And now we're talking about, well, the Seahawks have got a legitimate chance of being the number one seed. They're perhaps the favourites for the Super Bowl again. And that's all because of the guy under centre. They can lose players. They can lose a Michael Bennett. They can lose Thomas Rawls. They can lose Prosise. They can lose Marshawn Lynch. Whenever Wilson's there, they've got an opportunity. And I think he has galvanized this team more than any other player in the league. And I think that he has to be in the running for the MVP. It's a pleasure to watch him live. And I think that we will look back on Seattle's when he's like retired and everything. We will look back on the decision to spend a 3rd round pick on this guy in that draft with the same way that we look at Tom Brady being a 6th round pick and just wonder how on earth that situation played out. And we will also look back on Brady and Wilson's careers and think, wow, those two teams, they found the gem. And teams will be forever looking for that next gem in the middle rounds because of the likes of Brady and Wilson. Maybe Dak Prescott will be the next one. We'll have to wait and see. But certainly Wilson's up there with Brady for now.
Yeah, I mean, I have other things to say, but yeah, when you throw in Dak Prescott at the end there, I have thoughts on Dak Prescott, and I have, I think somewhat controversial to Seahawks fans, my thoughts on Dak Prescott, but we can talk about that at some point. But yeah, I mean, Russell Wilson right now, I mean, you look at his last 3 games, Russell Wilson has 8 total touchdowns, 6 passing, 1 rushing, 1 receiving. He's averaging 300 passing yards per game. And these are the things that people said that he couldn't do or that he wouldn't do. And it's like, okay, great. In the beginning of his career, his rushing stats were overlooked, and not really counted in, or people said like, oh, he can't do well if he's not running the football. Well, look, he's one of the least, he's putting up some of the fewest rushing yards in the NFL among quarterbacks. He's carried it 39 times for 79 yards this season. And it's because of that, in a way, because Russell Wilson is doing less, people are valuing him more and saying like, okay, because finally we're seeing people around the league that have for so long said that Russell Wilson was not, a quote unquote elite quarterback, finally putting him up there and saying, you know what, when you look around the league right now, You've got your Tom Brady. Cam Newton was obviously a one-year wonder. If you had listened to anybody on, I don't know, this podcast, maybe you would have seen that a year ago. Hey, look, people give me a lot of shit about bragging about when I'm right. But what the hell is the point of making proclamations if you're not going to tell people, hey, yeah, look, I was right about that one thing. Anyway, Russell Wilson, because he can't run the football and he's playing in the pocket, and look, at the same token, he has, before in 2012, 2013, when they were not like highlighting what, they said he didn't have that grade of receivers and stuff. Look, to the credit of Jimmy Graham and Doug Baldwin, they are great, great, great players. They are some of the best players in the NFL right now. And the fact that you're combining them with a guy who can make the throws that he can make. I mean, you cannot say that Russell Wilson is successful because he runs the football. You cannot say that he's successful because of Marshawn Lynch. You cannot say that he's successful because of the defense. You have to start putting it on Russell Wilson to say that Russell Wilson is successful because he is perhaps the best player in the NFL. And right now, we have to start facing the facts that he might be the best player in the NFL. He's 28 years old. He's thrown 2 interceptions this season on 335 attempts. He's thrown 17 interceptions dating back to the beginning of 2014. That's pretty close to the amount of interceptions that Blake Bortles and Ryan Fitzpatrick have this season in 10 games. And he's not just getting away with not throwing interceptions because he doesn't throw the football. I mean, he's on pace for well over 500 pass attempts this year. He's throwing the football quite a bit. They have opened up the offense to make it about Russell Wilson's arm. He's averaging 9.6 yards per attempt over the last 3 weeks. If you take away all of his throws to Jermaine Kearse, he's almost perfect. Every single target that goes to Jimmy Graham or Doug Baldwin is pretty much being caught, with the exception of maybe one a game. And right now, everything is working perfectly in that aspect of Seattle Seahawks football, and that's why they are, the best team in the NFL right now, in addition to the fact that their defense is phenomenal and the fact that they have, so many good players on defense. But absolutely, Russell Wilson is playing right now. And I think you can look back at the end of the year and say, at the end of 2015, and, obviously people in Seattle were saying that Russell Wilson was, maybe the best player in the NFL, but there was so much drowning out of that because of Cam Newton. And now there isn't anybody really standing out and drowning everyone out except for maybe Ezekiel Elliott. There aren't a lot of other MVP candidates out there that people are talking about, because of the fact that there aren't any like really great looking teams right now, except for if you start to acknowledge the Seahawks, in the fact that they have beaten the Patriots, the Eagles, the Dolphins, who are now, 6th in DVOA, and, the Buffalo Bills, who are a pretty good team, and, some of these really good teams. So, and the Falcons, of course. So it's like they're beating all these teams. They're winning on the road. The Seahawks look really, really good. And Russell Wilson is definitely a part of that. And as far as Dak Prescott goes, the fact that Dak Prescott is like 3rd in the NFL in yards per attempt and like, right up there 3rd or 4th or 5th in passer rating. I don't have all the numbers in front of me right now. The fact that he's actually throwing the ball and making it happen, and they're not just, it is Dak Prescott's team as much as anything else. And it's not like the Cowboys are winning because of defense, and Ezekiel Elliott's doing well and the offensive line is really good. But screw all that. Like if you have to make exceptions, if you're not a Cowboys fan, if you're a Seahawks fan and you have to make exceptions for why Dak Prescott is playing well, then you should not have had any say in the fact that when Russell Wilson was a rookie and when Russell Wilson was in his first couple years and putting up great numbers like yards per attempt and yet like passer rating, and he had a running game and he had, other things going for him, the offensive line was pretty good in 2013 when they won the Super Bowl. So when you have to make all of those exceptions for Dak Prescott, if you don't make those same exceptions, you better admit that Russell Wilson, that you think he's overrated too. So it's like, to me, I don't have to put down another player in order to rise up the one that's on my team. I can still look at another player and say, wow, he might actually be better than Russell Wilson was as a rookie. And I'm going to acknowledge that because it's a great thing to have in the league, is to have these guys that are exceptional and make everyone, around them look better. So I think that Dak Prescott should be getting all of the credit that he deserves for the numbers that he's putting up and not making exceptions for why he's doing it, because a lot of other guys could have gone out there, and we see so many bad quarterbacks, and it's like you still have to perform regardless of how much time you're given in the pocket. He hasn't been playing with Dez Bryant a whole bunch. Everything else, that regardless of who his running back is, you have to give him credit for stepping up with what he's been given, and he's not given a great defense, and he's playing for a coach that's never won a playoff game. And I think Dak Prescott is, an exceptional quarterback. And the fact that he was a 4th-round pick, yeah, it's going to be, we might be talking about. I recently, this week on Sports on Earth, ranked every quarterback in their first 3 years, including Carson Wentz, including Jameis Winston, including Marcus Mariota, who's playing phenomenally right now. And I still put Dak Prescott ahead of all of them, number one. So after all of those words, Rob, what are your thoughts on Dak Prescott and sort of, the comparisons to Russell Wilson, or, the numbers that he's putting up this season?
Well, I've been very impressed. I think going back to pre-season when he was playing for Dallas, you couldn't help but be impressed with him. It's for me, the main thing is that the level of poise that he shows, and because he is going to get protection from the Dallas offensive line, because teams are always going to be wary of the running game, it gives him an opportunity to excel if he can be poised. And that's exactly what he's done. He's never flustered. He generally, and Cowboys fans will tell you this, has struggled, or at least not started games particularly well. But then once he's settled down, he's pretty much unstoppable, and his accuracy increases. And they've created a fantastic situation. I mean, I genuinely believe that, and this is to the Joneses' credit. I don't know whether it's Stephen the son more than Jerry who has created this, but they've pretty much taken what the Seahawks did to them in 2012, when they gave them an absolute shellacking in week 2, Russell Wilson's second game as a pro. When the Seahawks had that 8-minute drive at the end of the game, they've pretty much taken that formula and created an offense which is very similar. So what they've got now is a running game which prospers. So a team will then get sucked into sort of 8-man boxes to try and stop Zeke Elliott. That creates a situation where your quarterback can do creative things. And if you've got a mobile quarterback, which they have, he can get out of the pocket. He's got that option to run as well. So you have to keep him in contain. So then what do? Do you try to keep Dak in contain, or do you try and keep Zeke Elliott in contain? What are you going to do? Pick your poison with that one, because if you choose one, the other guy's going to beat you. And on top of all of that, they've got weapons. They've got Des Bryant, they've got Jason Witten, who's admitted that he almost feels rejuvenated with Dak Prescott at quarterback now. That it's bringing the best out of him. People like Cole Beasley are valuable, options in the slot. They've got some decent attacking players. So when you look at all of that, they've got a fantastic little balance going on. And because Dak is showing this much potential in year 1, I think that it's exciting to wonder where he can get to. I think that that's going to be the big thing for him. I think we always kind of saw with Russell Wilson, and we watched him very closely as Seahawks fans, but you could always see that there was room for growth. You could see that we were only in 2012, and then I guess in 2013 as well, scratching the surface of what he was capable of. I think maybe that Atlanta game in the 2012 playoffs was the first time we saw Wilson at his absolute, this is what you could be. And then in 2013, it took him a while to get back to that level. Maybe he never quite got there. We started to see a bit more of that in 2015 at the end of last year. And you could see that there was still room for him to grow, and we're probably hitting his prime now. And with Dak Prescott, you just wonder what is his level going to be? Are we kind of seeing the best of him already? Is he going to be consistently good? But is this what he's going to be for basically the next 5 years? Is he ever going to be able to get much better than this, or is he just going to be consistently good? That's the sort of thing that I think with him, because I'm not convinced that he's going to grow and grow and grow. There's not really that much room for him to grow based on what he's shown this year. I think that he's maybe at a higher level now than Wilson was as a rookie, but he won't keep going like Wilson has. But what the Cowboys will be left with is a quarterback that they can win with for years to come. And he may never be quite as good as Wilson is down the line, but he will have them in contention, and he will help them win more games than they lose. And with Zeke Elliott, I mean, he's just a fantastic player. And with Dez still got a few years in front of him, and with that offensive line, they are going to take some. If they ever get a defense, Kenny, if they can get a few studs on defense, they're going to take some beating down. So they could be a genuine contender in the NFC for a long time.
It's going to be really interesting to see where the Cowboys go this season with Dak Prescott and what happens next. But I would be a little bit surprised because it's like when you see teams have great young quarterbacks, I would be a little bit surprised if the Cowboys aren't a perennial playoff team for the next 10 to 12 years. And if you don't see a lot of Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson games in the playoffs, a lot being 3, which is, a lot. There's not a lot, how many times, even Peyton Manning and Tom Brady have probably only faced off in the playoffs 5 or 6 times, maybe at most. But another aspect of the Seahawks game and the Eagles was, I'm sure you and everyone else at that stadium went nuts during CJ Prosise's 72-yard touchdown run. Unfortunately, perhaps when he jumped into the end zone, he broke his scapula, a lesson learned indeed. But in the 6 games that CJ Prosise did play this year, he averaged 63 total yards per game, and he only played in parts of some of those games. So he barely played. And you would think that a healthy CJ Prosise could easily average 100 yards per game total and maybe even more. 5.7 yards per carry. Of course, a lot of that coming on the 72, but I don't think that you can really say too many negative things about his other carries. And he had more receiving yards than he did rushing yards, 208 rushing yards or receiving yards this season, 12.2 yards per catch. That's an elite number for a running back. It's not something you see too often. That's Marshall Faulk type territory. I'm not comparing him to Marshall Faulk. I'm just saying it's that type territory. But CJ Prosise will miss probably at least the rest of the regular season and maybe return for the playoffs. Would be very helpful to the Seahawks to lock in that number 2 seed, which they can't move up or down this week, no matter what they do in Tampa Bay. If they win, though, and the Cowboys lose, they'll be that much closer to perhaps getting the number 1 seed. If they lose and another team wins, they'll be that much closer to, having to play in the wild card week. I don't think that the Seahawks will have to play in the wild card week. I'd say that their chances of getting a bye week at this point are probably close to 80%, if not higher, with the way that they're playing right now, with as much talent as they have, and the way that their schedule sets up over the next 6 games, with half of those coming at home and road games coming against the 49ers, the Bucs, and the Green Bay Packers, who are just 4-6. I would be pretty surprised the Seahawks don't finish with 12 wins this year. And that's going to be enough to get you the number 2 seed, if not the number 1 seed, but most likely probably the number 2 seed, because the Cowboys schedule also is, I think, fairly decent. And I would have to say that, with that being said, CJ Prosise played really well. His future looks really nice, although he has to protect himself because this is, 3 different injuries to 3 different parts of his bodies with his body within the last 3 months. So he really is going to have to find a way to protect himself. But what are your thoughts on CJ? We can basically do a season rookie retrospective on CJ Prosise right now because the season is over, not including the playoffs. What were your thoughts on CJ Prosise this year and how it sort of relates to next year? And what are your thoughts on George Farmer as the 3rd down back, the guy that the Seahawks have now, signed to the 53-man roster to basically get the 3rd down snaps?
Well, it's very disappointing to see Prosise out because he was just starting to really look dangerous, and that weakness, perceived weakness for the Seahawks for so long this year of a lack of a running attack was suddenly looking absolutely venomous with Thomas Rawls returning and Prosise in there, and fantastic little 1-2 punch they had going. He had the huge run. He was doing a lot in the passing game. I mean, I don't think the Seahawks win that game against New England without CJ Prosise, because his ability to sort of take snaps and move out wide and the little rub routes that they were doing. And I can't remember who it was who showed. It might have been Brian Billick, or it might have been Baldinger. It's not Baldinger because he's suspended. It must have been Billick or somebody. They showed a route that he ran. That only the guy who was saying this is a route that only a receiver would know. You have to have an understanding of this route to be able to perfect it, and that Prosise had done it perfectly against New England, and it was why he's such a dynamic weapon when they spread out the backfield. So to lose that now is really disappointing. In terms of him, well, it's hard to say what the issue is, because he may just be one of those players who's going to be constantly injury prone. And there's not a great deal you can do about that. None of the injuries that he's had, at least in Seattle, are of the, it's not like he's had an Achilles injury that keeps flaring up, or a hamstring, or, an ACL that he's re-injured or anything like that. It seems to be like he seems to have some of the more bizarre injuries, like a broken wrist, and now this, scapular, is it? It's not, you don't hear of broken scapulars that often. That's not a general injury that you hear too often. So it's frustrating, but it's also kind of like, well, what can you do about it? Well, maybe he could be a little bit stronger. To look at his frame, he doesn't have the frame of running back. He kind of has a frame which is, he looks like a converted receiver who's playing running back. He does not look like, usually when you have a running back, they're kind of like thick set, great big lower body sort of strength and power. And that's not Prosise. I mean, he looks like a receiver, and you do just wonder. I think he was listed about 220 or 222 or something in his combine. Maybe he's playing at like 210, and if he is, then the key for him is probably to get stronger, to get a more physical appearance, because that might help him withstand some of the punishment he's going to get at the NFL. I think in general, though, Kenny, it's a worrying situation for the Seahawks because, with respect to George Farmer, who I really liked at USC as a receiver and thought that he might get an opportunity in the next level as a receiver. With respect to him, they're now relying on Thomas Rawls and Alex Collins to sort of see this through. And they've clearly not trusted Collins in the slightest, to the fact that Tremaine Pope was actually active against Philadelphia and Collins was not, which says a lot really of how they're viewing Collins right now. So you could even argue it's just on Thomas Rawls. And this is a team that consistently, week in, week out, knew who was going to be the running back. It was Marshawn Lynch. And Lynch almost never missed time and could offer that physical, punishing running attack that the Seahawks crave. And now it's coming down to Thomas Rawls. And like Prosise, Rawls has not shown any ability to stay healthy. I mean, he's been banged up a lot as well. So it's been a position that over the years has been really secure and consistent for the Seahawks, but now is constantly a question mark. And it's for that reason that I think they're almost certainly going to draft a running back next year in 2017. It is a good class to do it, but they just have to keep adding bodies there until they find some level of health, because it's just too important a position for this team to be scratching around, scraping, looking for guys where they can. And they've already gone through Christine Michael, CJ Prosise, Thomas Rawls. The idea of having to rely on possibly Farmer and Collins and maybe Pope, if he can come back, to lead you to a title is a little bit concerning.
I'd also say, just to, as a reminder to everyone out there, when you think like third down backs, that means he gets 33% of the carries or whatever. And it's like, no, teams often don't get to third down. It's really maybe 12 or 13 times per game. And on those, you're mostly blocking, and if you're not blocking, you're probably, catching a pass as an out route or, going underneath or whatever. Like, there's a very good chance that, that George Farmer will play in this game and, and get 10 or 15 snaps and, never carry the ball. But we'll see, the fact that George Farmer, as I wrote today in the news about him being, added to the 53-man roster, was the number one wide receiver recruit in the nation in 2011. And he played at high school with Paul Richardson, Robert Woods, and Marquise Lee. He was better, considered a better prospect than all of them. And, now he's, here and, much like CJ Prosise, has a wide receiver background. And like you said about Prosise's ability to run those routes, maybe there's some of that knowledge there. And that's why they like George Farmer, though I don't think that it's like, I don't have high expectations for him. It makes sense why they went with Farmer as opposed to a lot of the other running backs that were available. And it'll be interesting to see what they do. Clearly, Pete Carroll likes something about him and they've kept him around. And speaking of replacements, speaking of guys that Pete Carroll likes, speaking of guys who have a lot of connections in college to other players on the Seahawks, and speaking of, guys who have been, the Seahawks have stashed for a couple years, Stephen Terrell will be making his first start most likely this Sunday against the Bucs, as Earl Thomas is going to miss 10 days or maybe a little bit more with a hamstring injury, as will Deshaun Shedd. And that means that Earl Thomas, they were only listing him as doubtful right now. Probably Earl Thomas is threatening people to not, rule him out at this point. And I do think there's something about the Seahawks that makes them, I do want to say that the Seahawks maybe are a little bit tougher than other teams. I think that's something that Pete Carroll clearly looks for in the draft and in free agency, is guys who might be a little bit tougher. How many quarterbacks would have missed no games with the injuries that Russell Wilson has? And how many, when they were going to the Super Bowl against the Patriots, all of those guys in the secondary had injuries that could have easily kept them out. And obviously it's the Super Bowl and there's the higher stakes, but still they didn't miss the game. Maybe risked further injury. Maybe it hurt Cam Chancellor's overall career, but it was something that they insisted on playing. And I'm sure that Earl Thomas is not going to allow themselves to be ruled out, though Michael Bennett has been ruled out already. And I think that what I want to get onto a little bit is just Steven Terrell, his 4.35 40 that he ran at his Texas A&M Pro Day. I speak about connections at that same Pro Day were DeMontre Moore, who's been playing for the Seahawks in these last few weeks and seemed to do quite well, and Eze Nwachukwu, who was in the Seahawks during spring training, during training camp. And so they've had Steven Terrell around since 2014. He was with the Jaguars and the Houston Texans in 2013. And he's a guy that they've kept around as Earl Thomas's backup now for a couple of years, going into this is now his third year doing that. And he's got that blazing speed. He's got the same height. He's got the same weight. He's got everything that Earl Thomas has in a way physically. I think that you can't downplay that mentality, though, of Earl Thomas and what he brings to the Seattle Seahawks. Do you have any sort of evaluation on Steven Terrell? Did you know about him going into the 2013 draft? Is he someone that you sort of have been intrigued by for a while? And what are your sort of expectations of Steven Terrell if he does get his first start?
No, I don't remember much about him going into the draft. I do think that he has got some valuable special teams, or some special teams value rather, to the Seahawks, which is why he's stuck around. When I know a lot of people have been saying, why have they kept him? He's also pretty versatile and can play a couple of positions. I don't think he played brilliantly when he came on for Earl Thomas on Sunday. Being able to see the whole field and focus on the defense there, his number kept flashing up, but not necessarily in the best way. So it is going to be interesting to see how, because it looks as if he is going to have to play this game against Tampa Bay. It'll be interesting to see whether the Seahawks have to adjust their scheme, whether they do anything differently because they haven't got Earl Thomas back there. Terrell's quite a good athlete, but he's not Earl Thomas. If he wasn't, he wouldn't be a Seahawks backup safety. So they're going to have to do things a little bit differently, probably. And this is why I think this game is really interesting, because it might end up being a bit of a shootout again. It might be the type of game where the Seahawks have got to go toe to toe on offense. And they have been able to do that against, two good opponents, Philadelphia. They put points on the board. New England, they have scored points recently, but they've got to keep doing that. Let's hope that the weather's pretty good for this game, because I think the Seahawks are going to need that. They're going to need to be able to throw the ball, because they maybe are going to give up one or two plays on defense in this game. It's going to be tougher for them, that's for sure. So, my expectation or hope for Steven Terrell is just do whatever job that is set out for you. Try not to make too many mistakes. I really think this is going to be the kind of game where Cam Chancellor is so important. Getting everybody lined up, getting everybody in the right position, making sure that everybody knows what they're supposed to be doing. Because without Shed and without Thomas and without Michael Bennett, that is going to be a real test for this defense.
Do you have any thoughts? And we talk a little bit about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Do you have any thoughts on the second season of Jameis Winston over the last 6 games or something like that? They've gone 4-2. He's put up something like 17 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. Marcus Mariota and him are both coming into good numbers here at about the same time, after being the 1-2 pick last year. And the fact that they've got Mike Evans, would you expect, because after Mike Evans, they got nothing. So, it's not that much different than Philadelphia with Jordan Matthews, Evans is better than Matthews, but what's after Evans is pretty bad, and or at least not super productive. So would you expect Richard Sherman to cover Evans throughout the whole game? And what are your thoughts on Jameis Winston, his ability to sort of take over a game at this point?
They're a funny team, because I've watched Tampa Bay I think 3 times, and one of the times was when they got absolutely destroyed by Arizona in week 2. And I was working for national radio here in the UK, and that was the game that we were covering. And it was just incredible how bad they were on the day. And that was the week after they beat Atlanta in Atlanta on the opening weekend and looked really good. And then I saw them lose to Los Angeles at home. They conceded 37 points to the LA Rams. The concept of the LA Rams putting 37 points on the board is faintly ridiculous given what we know about them so far. But they did it against this Buccaneers team. They were absolutely destroyed by Denver. I saw most of that game. I saw them be. I've seen them quite a few times actually. I think I saw them. Might have been a primetime game. The Tampa Bay Carolina game might have been on Sunday Night Football, unless I'm mistaken, or Monday Night Football. And I remember watching that. And again, I think they might have played. I don't think Cam Newton played in that game. I think it was Derek Anderson, and they squeezed past. Their kicker was missing loads of kicks at that point. There was the terrible loss to Atlanta, which I think was Monday Night Football as well, where they were just awful. I mean, just awful defensive performance. Atlanta put 43 points on the board. And then to follow that, which was a really demoralizing loss for them. I mean, they were hopeless against Atlanta. To follow that, they destroyed Chicago, which you'd expect. And then they go and win in Kansas City. So I don't really know what to make of that. I mean, I think people are maybe overrating the win in Kansas City because I don't think the Chiefs are as good as people think. They're still an Andy Reid-led team, which they always flatter to deceive. Andy Reid teams, they always look generally balanced and quite good, but then when it comes to actually doing something in a season, they generally collapse. I don't think that Alex Smith is anything like good enough to lead them to a championship. Or a couple of playoff wins. He's a regular season quarterback. They will win most of the games they're supposed to win. Alex Smith will not make mistakes, but then you put him on the spot and you need him to win a game for you, he won't do it. And that's ultimately, I think, what happened. I've not watched the whole of that game because I was in Seattle, but that's ultimately what I think happened there. And when I look at them, I think that Mike Evans is just fantastic. By the way, I just love Mike Evans. He's the type of receiver I wish the Seahawks had been able to acquire quite early in the Pete Carroll era, because I think that I generally think the Seahawks would have, with some Wilson thrown to somebody like that, it would have been a real benefit for him, and I think he would have maybe aided his progress. You can pretty much do anything with Mike Evans. You can line him up in the slot. You can go deep. He's just such a good player. A great complement of size, hands, speed, wingspan, just everything. And I think he's probably going to have a 100-yard game in this game. He's going to make plays. I don't think you can stop him making plays. I think he's that good. Winston goes from looking great 1 minute to pretty hopeless the next. He is quite mobile. He can throw it around. I suspect he's going to throw it a lot in this game. I think you can pressure him into mistakes in a way that you I mean, Carson Wentz had a couple of turnovers, but I think Carson Wentz is more conservative and less error prone than Winston is. So I think that the Seahawks can maybe bait him into a few mistakes. Maybe he will test Richard Sherman a couple of times and get burnt. But I do think they will put up plays. And I think what the key is going to be is, look, the Rams put 37 points on this team on the road. Atlanta put 43 points on this team on the road. Denver put 27 on this team on the road. Can you go there? Oakland put 30 on them. Can you go there and score 30, 40 points like those teams have to win this game of football? And then it won't really matter what they do. And that's going to be the key. It's really going to come down to Seattle's offense, I think.
Rob, let me get a record prediction from you, and I'll say it while I give you a couple seconds here to let it start sinking in. Their last 6 games are at Tampa Bay, home against Carolina, at Green Bay, home against the Rams, home against the Cardinals, and at San Francisco. How do they do in those 6 games? What is your record prediction over their last 6 games given that schedule?
I think that I'm kind of torn between 5-1 and 4-2. I'd like to sort of be bold and say 5-1 that they're only going to lose one more game, and I do think they will lose a game. I know that a lot of people think they're going to win out. That's fine. I just think that whether it's Green Bay and on the road, whether Rodgers will just turn it on, with them being pretty desperate, whether it's the Rams coming to CenturyLink Field and getting their annual Super Bowl win in Seattle, or whether it's the Cardinals finding a way to beat. I mean, the Seahawks generally tend to lose one game late on, so I think that they probably are going to lose another game this year. It's whether or not they're going to lose another one. And I think if they can beat the Bucs, then I'll feel very confident about just saying it's going to be a one loss. But this could be one that really sort of shows us what the remainder of this season is going to be. But I will say this: I think even if they finish the season 4-2, I think that they will claim at least the number 2 seed. I think that the Cowboys are probably going to go 4-2 as well. So I think 4 wins will be enough, because I don't see a team like Atlanta. Let's not forget, Seahawks have got a tiebreaker over Atlanta already. They've got the win in Seattle, which will keep them above Atlanta, and they have the drawn game, which is sort of like half a win as well. So they've got a little bit of an edge on Atlanta. Carolina's probably got too much to do to catch Seattle for the number 2 seed. The teams in the NFC East, if Dallas finish number 1, can't catch Seattle for the number 2 seed, because they'll be a wild card team anyway. And Detroit, I just don't see Detroit are a really inconsistent team. I mean, they could win or lose any week. So I think that imagining Detroit sort of winning 12 games and winning out is a little bit unrealistic as well. So I think 4 wins is a conservative estimate, and I think that would be enough for the number 2 seed.
Moving ahead to and I just want last thing about the Seahawks. It's just crazy. I mean, it's just not crazy, but here we are now, 10 games into the season, and the Seahawks lead the NFL in scoring defense. If they can finish that out, they'll be the 5th straight season that they've done that, and they are first in DVOA. And if they can do that, they'll be the 5th straight win of being first in DVOA. This era of football is freaking unbelievable. Just let it all sink in. It's some point soon they aren't going to be this good. Just let it sink in. So, leading the league in scoring defense, and they've got maybe the best player in the NFL, and he's not even on the defense. So it should be really, really interesting to see what happens here. The Seahawks couldn't be in a better position right now. And, I know once again, like it happens every year, people didn't feel that way after 5 games or whatever, but here we are again. Moving ahead to the next year's draft, just a little bit before we wrap up the show. You wrote today about a certain player from another small school that, and at least a small football school. And, I remember when Byron Jones came out in 2014 or 2015, that was, how few good players had come out of school. I think Byron Jones might be the highest drafted player ever out of it. So what are your thoughts on UConn's Obi Melifonwu?
Well, I like him, first of all, because he was born in London. So we're going to claim him as a Brit at this point and celebrate him. I think, seriously, a guy on the blog suggested that I check this guy out, and I'd noticed that his name had come up in a Daniel Jeremiah on NFL.com does these pieces called Ask 5, which is kind of a lame name for an article, but he calls it Ask 5, and he basically asks 5 executives a question. And in this instance, it was to ask these NFL executives for, an under-the-radar player, not a big name, but who has got the most potential. And 4 of the executives kind of named players that were, it's hard to get excited about. Seth Russell, for example, at Baylor, that like one of the guys had named. Can you imagine Seth Russell having a fantastic NFL career? Perhaps not. Deshaun Hall at Texas A&M has got great length, great size. He's an interesting player, but has he got the biggest upside? Who's not a big name? Not for me. And then there was this interesting one, and it was this safety from UConn, and this guy this executive said he's basically going to be fantastic. That he's 6'3", 220, can run a 4.4 or a 4.3. He's going to jump over 40 inches in the vertical jump, and basically he's Byron Jones again. Byron Jones, who went to Connecticut and was the 27th overall pick in 2015 because of his brilliant combine workout. This guy, Melifonwu, is bigger than Jones. He's about a couple of inches taller, about 20 pounds heavier. And I found some videos of his head coach talking about him, the head coach at UConn. And he could not, I don't think I've ever seen a coach as gushing in his praise, basically saying to the NFL, come and get this guy. He is that good. He's going to blow you away at the combine. I mean, you just don't hear head coaches talking this way about a player. And it was almost like campaigning for him to be a first-round pick. And then he did an interview last week where he said, basically, I'm not going to name the NFL player that reminds me of because I don't think it's very fair. And, he's obviously not as good as this player, but athletically he's going to be better. And, if you think there aren't many safeties in the NFL that are 6'3" and about 220 pounds. There's only kind of one, and he plays for Seattle. And I suspect that he was talking about Cam Chancellor in that regard. And when I watched him, and I've only watched one video, and usually I would like to watch 3 before passing comment, but I'm going to make an exception on this one because he is quite an exciting player, and I want to bring his name to the table. So you're talking about a safety that's 6'3", 220. He lines up as the single high safety, which is what Earl Thomas does in Seattle, and does the job really well. So on one play that Virginia threw to the right sideline, he's the single high safety. He's sprinted across, so half the field, to get to the ball carrier, having read the play, and he's the one who delivers the hit to dislodge the football and break up the pass. I mean, it's an incredible show of read and react, recovery speed, and then the ability to deliver a smashing hit to dislodge the football. There was another play where he lined up in the slot and covered a tight end, broke the pass up really well. There was another play where he blitzed off the edge. There was a play where he was in a more sort of orthodox Cam Chancellor type position on the field. The running back, he has sprinted 15 yards and leveled the running back at the line of scrimmage for no gain with an incredible burst of pace, great speed, great hit. In this game against Virginia, he didn't miss a single tackle. I mean, whenever he needed to make the tackle, he would make the tackle. He's such a formed tackler. And just everything about him, Kenny, was really, really interesting. Now, he's got 4 interceptions this year. He's got nearly 100 tackles already. He's got a couple of tackles for a loss. If he is anything like Byron Jones as an athlete, and looking at him on tape, there's every chance that he could be, then this is a guy who could easily go in the first round. And it is a great safety class. There is going to be a lot of competition there, but there just aren't many human beings that can do what he supposedly can do. And the tape is exciting. And I just wonder if, you could theoretically, if you were the Seahawks, for example, if you were looking for a player like this, you could use him as a Sam or as a death backer in that kind of Deion Buchanan role, because he can do that. You could line him up in the slot. You could line him up outside at corner. You could line him up at safety if you wanted to do. I mean, the safeties are getting banged up. Earl's going to miss a game. Cam's missed games. He could be a fill in there as well if you needed him to be. He's a guy who could do a lot of different things for you, and he can probably provide some special teams value as a rookie as well. So, we know they like unique athletes. We know that they like those certain traits. We know they like size and length in the secondary. This is a guy that we really need to keep an eye on. And I'm not sure if this is a position where they would draft an early pick, essentially for somebody who's not going to be an immediate starter or contribute in a massive way immediately. They might prefer to go for the offensive line. They might prefer to go for a defensive lineman or a receiver or something like that. But this is a guy that I really think we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about that Ask 5 article or question, what executive that wants to keep his job would tell you about an under-the-radar player, whether it's anonymous or not? It just doesn't really make a ton of sense. Like, you would think that they would just throw out bad names, not that that was necessarily the case with Obi, because players will be whatever they'll be. And if there's a guy that would just like, well, look, everyone's going to find out about this guy when he runs the 40 or whatever. Even then, it's like, well, what if he gets hurt? Don't let him run the 40. Let him slip to the 6th round and draft him there. But Byron Jones, I interviewed him in 2015 or whatever. Very nice guy, very humble guy, and perhaps the greatest athlete to ever enter the combine. So, whatever it's going to be for Obi, certainly like that name. And one other thing about the draft next year, there's a lot of speculation, as always, about who the Seahawks could pick, just like everyone wonders who their team could pick. And the way that the offensive line is playing right now, and the way that I think about how the Seahawks and Pete Carroll and John Schneider want to build this roster, I'm having a harder and harder time believing that they will draft an offensive lineman with their first pick. I still think it's almost certain that they'll trade down or trade out. But I just don't see it being an offensive lineman. I really think that if they could, they would target a defensive tackle, which is a position. I think that would be Pete Carroll's dream, would just be a great defensive tackle that they, can have for 5 years and not worry about it. And, because they've had to sign so many guys at the position in the last 3 months that it's just becoming comical that they can't just, other than Atiba Rubin and Tony McDaniel, and Tony McDaniel coming out of nowhere, other than those two, that they get to play them every week. I think they would just love to have a guy who's not, 30 years old that they can plug in there for the next 5 years. So I would think that defensive tackle would be their greatest desire, as well as, pass rusher, which is going to be the same every year. If you think that a great pass rusher is available to you, you're not going to pass on him. But I also look at, a big wide receiver or tight end, because, as much as they have Nick Vannett and that's great, but that the fact of the matter is, I think that they know now how dangerous Russell Wilson is with a Jimmy Graham and type target. So it's like, if something happens to Jimmy Graham again, you want to have more options, especially, and also the fact that really the only receiver that they have to feel comfortable with in the long term right now is Doug Baldwin. And I think that Tyler Lockett is a phenomenal player, but I don't think you can necessarily feel comfortable about him until he can play healthy and play whole season. Tyler Lockett hasn't scored a touchdown yet, and it's injuries, it's not playing on offense enough, and it's all that kind of stuff. But I think that wide receiver is not something that they're ever going to feel comfortable with. And so if there's one there at the end of the first round that they really, really like, I think that wide receiver is something that they're not going to stop doing. They've done it with Golden Tate. They've done it with Paul Richardson. They've done it with Tyler Lockett. It's a position that they value so highly in the draft. It's not, and that's the whole thing, is that they have guys that they value in free agency, and they have guys that they value in the draft. And in the draft, they value offensive linemen and wide receivers because they don't feel necessarily comfortable that they can get their guys in any other way, unless it's like a trade with a first-round pick for Jimmy Graham or a trade with a first-round pick for Percy Harvin. That's what they believe that those draft picks are for. So, Rob, I guess my first part of this question would be, do you agree? And my second part of the question would be wide receivers, tight ends, and defensive tackles. How's that looking for the end of the first and up until the middle of the second round?
Yeah, I think it's a good point that you make overall, Kenny. I think that the offensive line has shown enough growth that they can feel comfortable not having to force the need on this. And that's important because it's not a good draft for offensive linemen. And while I'm particularly a massive fan of Garrett Bowles at Utah, one, he might not declare, and two, he might go a lot earlier than I've been putting him with the Seahawks in round one, but he could easily be a top 20 pick. He is the best offensive tackle in college football, and for me, it's not even close. So if he declares, there's every chance that he won't be there for the Seahawks, let alone them taking him at whatever they're going to end up picking. So they might be forced to look in other ways, because I don't see them taking Cam Robinson. I don't see anything in the Wisconsin guy that's particularly interesting. I don't see this as a draft where there's not going to be a Jermaine Ifedi sort of sat there at the end of the first round, I don't think, unless Garrett Bowles is there. So it might be that they ultimately have one tackle option in the first round, and it's Bowles from Utah. And if he's not there, they can't do anything about that. So they might have to look at other positions. And when I look at this draft, I mean, it is fantastic for defensive linemen. And I think you're right. I don't think it's a pure defensive tackle that they would probably go for. I think that Jaron Reed is sort of that pick already, and I think that they've probably found that
I forgot about Jaron Reed. I just want to apologize to everyone out there that I didn't mention Jaron Reed. He's been healthy since he came back, and of course, they just picked him.
But they've found Tony McDaniel, and they've got value from Tony McDaniel as a guy that nobody else wanted on the street. They plucked a Taba Rubin from Cleveland and have made him into a pretty much a focal point of the defensive line. So with Reed as well in the equation, and Rubin's going to be there again next year. We don't know what's going to happen with McDaniel. I would suspect that they would back themselves to find somebody else to sort of fill into that rotation. What I think they would really like to have is another guy that can rush inside or out. So somebody who can maybe line up a defensive end on an early down, kick inside, and play defensive tackle on third down or a passing down, especially because, Jordan Hill, they kind of had him for that. He's gone. Quinton Jefferson came in. He's gone on injured reserve. Is there somebody else that they brought in Demontre Moore essentially to try and play that role? And I think that is a position they would like a little of extra depth at, especially because Frank Clark now is predominantly playing off the edge and not kicking inside as much. At least that's what it looks like. Or if he is kicking inside, he's lost a bit of weight. It's not necessarily ideal for him. So I think it's another inside-out rusher that they would ideally like to have. There are some options here. I can run through some names for you, but I think there's that. There's another. They could go for another edge rusher. If they were doing things like that, it'd just be going along with where the strength of this draft is. This is going to be a really good draft for me. Cornerback, safety, and defensive line. They are the sort of the three positions to target. I think they could go receiver, but I think there's better value at receiver later in the draft. And that's something that they've also done. They have taken receivers early. They've also tried to find them in the sort of the fourth or fifth round. So I think there's a chance that they could wait a little bit later and get a good receiver. Wouldn't totally rule it out. What I will say is whoever they take in the first round, he's going to have to be a fantastic athlete. He's going to have, twitchy traits. He's going to have, a really good combine probably. And he's going to have to be sort of really intense on the field. That's consistently what they've done. So let's see what people do at the combine, and then we'll get a good picture of who is or isn't likely to be taken by this team. In terms of some of the names that I would mention, I don't know whether Dwayne Smoot is going to go too early. I mean, I think he could be a top 15 pick, but I think the way that he rushes off the edge, the fact that he could probably play a bit of Sam as well, like Bruce Irvin, is a name, the Illinois edge rusher, he's a name to keep an eye on. I think Tack McKinley is just, he would be, the more I watch of him, and I watched the UCLA USC game at the weekend, the more I watch of him, the more that he could be kind of their ideal pick if they were going to go for defensive lineman, because he can play inside or out. He's only scratching the surface of his potential. He's kind of gone through adversity and come out the other side. He's got a cracking personality as well. Really, really quirky personality. So Tack McKinley at UCLA, I mean, I personally think he's going to go in the top 10. If he doesn't go in the top 10 and if he lasts until the end of the first round, I think Tack McKinley is somebody that we certainly need to keep an eye on as well. I think DeMarcus Walker is somebody who remains interesting. He's got more sacks than anybody, I think, in college football this year. Really like what he's brought to the table. Carl Lawson at Auburn has had a pretty solid year. Solomon Thomas at Stanford is an interesting player. I mean, I don't know if he's quite good enough off the edge. Maybe he could add a little bit more size and work as that sort of inside-out rusher and work more from the interior as a threat. I think that's potential for him. But they're just some of the names that I would have a look at here, because it is generally a good class for defensive linemen. And I think that if they were going to go with the strength of the draft, and the Seahawks have quite often detected where the strengths are and then sort of got value from that, I think that is definitely a direction they could go.
One other thing that I do want to just quickly address, just because this is 3,000 NFL mock draft, we talk about the draft. What's more important in the draft than the number one overall pick? We've talked a lot about Jared Goff on this podcast. He makes his NFL debut last Sunday against the Miami Dolphins. And interestingly enough, the Miami Dolphins, when the Seahawks beat them in week 1, 12-10, a lot of people saying, oh God, Seattle just looked kind of bad against a team that's not very good. The Dolphins have won 5 straight games, and, in DVOA, they're like 6th in DVOA. Their defense looks pretty good. They're definitely they're on a roll. And, I don't think they're going to make it. They could go to the playoffs. I don't think they're going to necessarily win a playoff game, but they're doing really well. I thought it was a strange time to make Jared Goff have his NFL debut. If you're going to do it, why do it now? Why not do it against the New York Jets, a team that's not very good, or the Carolina Panthers, who have had a lot of problems on defense? So, that was two weeks ago. There are a lot of other things. Then you start him at home against the Miami Dolphins, a good team. And then they have to now, the 3 of the next 4 games are on the road, including at New Orleans, at New England, and at Seattle. And the game in the sandwich at home is against the Falcons. To me, if you're going to do it, why not do it against the Falcons in week 14? By that time, you will be eliminated from the playoffs, which is what Jeff Fisher originally said his plan for was Jared Goff, which was to not play him until they were eliminated from playoff contention. They decided not to do that. And if you play him in week 14 against the Falcons, then 3 of his 4 games this season are at home. He's playing against bad teams like the 49ers and the Cardinals, who I think by now we can admit are not very good. And, in his tough test, of course, being at the Seattle Seahawks, but still, I think that would have been a much easier landing spot for him. And Jared Goff in his NFL debut, not only do they, he averaged 4.3 yards per attempt, which is just one of the worst marks you'll ever see, or you'll see, pretty much at any time. And it's one thing to say, well, they limited his playbook and he couldn't throw the ball downfield, which, I would say, why not? What is the reason for that? Because he cannot do it? That's the problem. Their receivers, are they good? No. But, the fact is he still passed for fewer yards in that game than Case Keenum did all season long, with exception of week 1 against San Francisco. So Jared Goff's NFL debut goes fairly horribly. You don't want to put his whole future into this game, but I do think that he's going to only face tougher and tougher contests. As I said, 3 of the next 4 are on the road and against pretty good teams. Even the Saints defense is looking much better now than it has in the last few years. And the New England Patriots, as we've seen, do not have the greatest defense, but are still the Patriots. And then he has to face the Seahawks 2 weeks after that. So did you get a chance to watch Jared Goff at all this weekend? And did you have any thoughts on, his performance in the playbook?
I watched a little bit of the game from CenturyLink Field. I've watched a little bit more of it since, just because I wanted to have a look at Goff in particular today. And I watched a bit on Game Pass, but not the whole game. I mean, I think I truly believe there's been a bit of pressure from ownership on why Goff played this week, because this is a franchise that is just sending people to sleep. I mean, they're playing a horrible brand of football. They have totally ruined the potential of Todd Gurley, who is still averaging about 3 yards a carry, which is horrendous. They're when they win, it's 9-3. When they lose, it's stuff like 13-10 and 17-10, and they beat the Jets 9-6. And I think the owners just basically said, "Look, we've spent all this draft stock and all this money on this guy as the first overall pick. Carson Wentz is playing and winning games. Dak Prescott's playing and winning games. Cody Kessler's even coming in for praise at Cleveland. Let's give this guy, we're not winning enough games to justify keeping this guy on the bench anymore. I want to see this number 1 overall pick playing." And I suspect there's a bit of pressure in LA because the style of football is so bad, and they're just seeing no progress. There's just no progress at any point in this Jeff Fisher regime. They're just not taking any steps forward. They're just constantly miserable and mediocre. I think there's probably a bit of pressure on him now. And if they didn't play him in this Miami game, then it's at the Saints next. So do you really want him to get to the Superdome for his debut? Probably not. It's still a tough place to go and play. It's still pretty loud. The following week, they're at New England. Do you want him to play on the road against New England for his debut? No. And you'd have to wait 3 more weeks to do it. And at that point, you maybe are out of playoff contention, and maybe Jeff Fisher's looking for a new job. So I think that there's probably a bit of pressure from above, probably a bit of pressure on Jeff Fisher to get this guy in there. If he's playing and they're not winning, he can make the excuse of, well, at least the guy's learning while we're losing. While you're stubbornly not playing him and playing Case Keenum, you're not learning anything. If you're Jared Goff, you're learning how to stand and watch Case Keenum lose a game of football. So, and they probably thought that maybe this would just give them a bit of a jolt as well. And they probably should have beaten the Dolphins, and really they were quite useless in losing and throwing that game away. I think that the Rams need a new coaching staff. They need some charisma. They need some energy. They need some excitement. Do you know what they need? They need Adam Gase. When you're watching Adam Gase on that sideline, and the way that he's just looks like a really good coach in the making, his body language, what he's doing there, the fact that he's created an identity at Miami despite the constant churning of the roster and the constant changes of GM and the people running the team. He's just gone in there, and it's taken him a few weeks to get it right, but he's got it right. They've suddenly got a running back who can run the ball. They've got Ryan Tannehill playing decent football. They've got receivers. They've got a defense that is kind of competent. They look tough. They look like a team you don't really want to play. When's the last time you said that about the Miami Dolphins? I mean, Gase has just energized that franchise. I know a Dolphins fan. he's incredibly optimistic about the direction this team's going. He's got the Miami fans believing again. It's almost the way that the Miami fans are believing is kind of reminiscent of the way the Seahawks fans were believing in 2012. It's got that similar energy to it. And you look at LA, and they've got none of that. And they need their version about Adam Gase. They need somebody who can get this quarterback playing. They need someone who can put an offensive product on the field which can move the ball. And yeah, you know what? That defense is going to be there. That defense is still going to be there, but they need somebody who can actually drive the offense forward. And they just have not got that at all with Jeff Fisher. I don't think we could learn anything from Goff's performance because they were so ultra conservative against the Dolphins. But I think what we can learn from the 5 years of Jeff Fisher now, whatever it is, that he's been part of the Rams, this franchise needs a change. It needs new blood. It needs new energy. It needs new ideas. It needs to just move on from this. And considering he hasn't signed his contract extension, I'm going to hope for the sake of the Rams fans that there is a chance that they will go in a different direction. I personally hope it happens because it will potentially remove those one or two awkward losses the Seahawks seem to have to Jeff Fisher every single year. Maybe they'll have more success against a new coaching staff. But I think for the success of the Rams, they really need to move on.
Yeah, it would be about time. Obviously, maybe I would be a bit late. But, whether or not they actually make that move after so much, sort of defense of Jeff Fisher and thoughts about Les Snead and, talking about extensions in the beginning of the year and everything. It's interesting to see whether or not they'll actually pull the trigger on that, whether or not the Jacksonville Jaguars will pull the trigger on making moves at GM and head coach. When you've been sticking to your guns for so long, it's hard to let go of them and hand them over. So, that's sort of the predicament that those teams are in. And I do believe in giving head coaches chances, further out than 1 or 2 years. I think some teams are obviously way too quick to give up on guys. And sometimes you do have to go through 3 years of being bad. But the Rams and the Jaguars have certainly gotten more than enough evidence out of their head coaches at this point to maybe not believe that this is the right answer. And I hate to say that about Gus Bradley, but pretty bad. Pretty bad. I believe that's it for 3000 NFL Mock Draft. As I said in the beginning of the show, it is Thanksgiving weekend. Rob, over in the UK, do you guys have any holidays where you just eat food, that it's a holiday that moves around getting together with your family just to eat?
We don't, which is a real shame. We eat a lot at Christmas, but I imagine that's pretty similar for you guys in America. We don't. I mean, obviously, there's a reason why we don't celebrate Thanksgiving over here, because it's kind of celebrating America's independence from Great Britain. We're kind of not invited to that particular party. But I would like to thank all of the listeners who listen to this. Thanks for tuning in and listening to a British guy talk to Kenny about American football every week. Have a great Thanksgiving, and let's hope that it's going to be a pretty good new year as well for the Seahawks, and that we're just sort of witnessing the second championship of the Pete Carroll era. I think there's a lot to be optimistic about, a lot to be excited about in terms of the remainder of this season, but also a lot to be excited about the draft. This is looking like it's going to be one of the best draft classes we've had in an awful long time, with big names at the top of the first round, a lot of depth to follow after that. So I think we're going to have a pretty interesting next few months.
Absolutely. And, one thing you do celebrate on Thanksgiving is 3 games during the day on a Thursday. So, Rob, you won't have to stay up till 4 a.m. necessarily to watch football.
What happens is, unfortunately, I host a radio show which finishes at 7 o'clock at night. So I will miss the first hour and a half of the first game, which is Detroit against Minnesota, but I will record it. I will avoid Twitter for an hour and a half. I will get home. I'll watch it, fast forwarding through the ad breaks and halftime. And then by the time the second game kicks off, which is Dallas against Washington, that kicks off at about 9:30 British time. So it's perfect for me. I can come home from work. I can get the TV remote off my poor suffering wife, and I can just sit and watch football all night.
Yeah. So yeah, that sounds like a good plan. I was trying to look it up here because I'm not exactly sure, but yeah, the third game, it looks like, Andrew Luck's been ruled out, so it's going to be Steelers Colts, And so I think that Scott Tolzien is the backup that will get starting. They get the start against the Steelers. And then the second game is Washington against Dallas. And Washington, everybody in the NFC East looking pretty good. Everybody in the NFC East and the AFC West has a positive point differential right now, whereas everybody in the AFC North, I saw a thing where the AFC North's record this season against the NFC East is 1-11-1. So they're just getting torched. And despite all that, I wouldn't be surprised if the Ravens or the Steelers ended up getting hot in the playoffs because it's just that sort of year right now, a weird year in the NFL. But all that stuff aside, that's it for 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Follow Rob on Twitter at Rob Staten, and go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Subscribe to this podcast through Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. I meant to say that at another point, but yeah, this will be the 3000 NFL Mock Draft podcast is moving over to that RSS feed just to tighten things up a little bit. And go to fieldgoals.com. Follow us on Twitter at fieldgoals. Like us on Facebook, facebook.com/fieldgoals. Rob, did you ever set up a Facebook page for Seahawks Draft Blog?
No, I have not. I think if I did that as well, I would have literally no personal life left. So I've not done that now.
It's quite shocking that you have any at all to begin with, a personal life, given the fact that football seems to be your side project. So
don't worry. When the second child arrives in January, I think that the last few shreds of my personal life will have well and truly gone. So,
yes, blessed taking away of the rest of your minutes of the day. Thanks everybody for listening. That's been this episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Come back next week for a new draft.